Okay, so it's time to reconvene, and we have our first speaker for the afternoon. It's going to be Dr. Alexandra Wallin, and she's from Strasbourg. She's going to talk about differences and similarities in Gandharan art production. The case of the modeling school of Haḍḍa, Afghanistan. Please.
Thank you. Maybe I'm waiting for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Maybe I can help. I'm going to see if I think we're pretty much, almost everyone is in.
Peter is here too?
Perhaps we can start right there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to express my gratitude and thanks to Dr. Peter Stewart for his invitation. It is for me an honor to participate in this workshop organized by the Classical Art Research Center and dedicated to the Geography of Gandharan Art. As we know it, the expression of this sacred art in the service of the geography of the Buddha varies according to the regions where it developed. Gandharan art is a result of so many artistic influences, peculiar executions, and iconographic specificities that the organization of such workshops is essential in enlightening some problematics by putting in common specific knowledge and different points of view. How were the ancient production workshops organized? Were there itinerant artists? Which paths were borrowed by the different artistic influences? Did they come in several successive waves? In which direction did they propagate? How can we explain their liveliness and longevity? It is up to us to work together to confront our observations and to apprehend them in their individuality as well as in their entirety, in order to understand evolutions, exchanges, and interactions that make Gandharan art so alive. To this purpose, we're going to consider the case of the modeling school of Haḍḍa in Afghanistan. The profusion of artistic production in Haḍḍa is such that many masterpieces deserve to be highlighted. However, I try to choose the most eloquent and representative examples. Let me introduce the monastery of Haḍḍa and some general considerations about its related school of art. Haḍḍa is a modern village in Afghanistan located near Jalalabad and built on the ruins of a pre-Islamic city on which depended a great Buddhist monastic complex that flourished during the earliest centuries of Christian era. From the 19th century, the successive works of General Court, Charles Mason of the East India Company, and William Simpson lead to the discovery of many artifacts and ancient coins from Greco-Bactrians to Yevtalid's periods, revealing that the monasteries had had a very long period of activity. Between 93 and 98, Alfred Fouché, director of the French Archaeological Mission in Afghanistan, commissioned Jules Barthou, who excavates 7 important sites: Tapekalan, the Great Hill, Borgai, Garnao, Prates, Charil-Irundi, and Deirundi, and Tapay-Kafaria. From this moment, Fouché established a link between the sites of Taxila and Haḍḍa, on which we will come back later in this presentation. Adorning the stupa, the chapels, and the monasteries, he discovered a whole population of statues modeled in clay and stucco, more than 15,000 sculptures, testimonies of Hellenistic Buddhist art in its maturity. After Barthou's mission, archaeological excavations stopped and did not resume until 1965 with a survey of Lalma by the Japanese team of Saichi Mizuno. The newly established Afghan Institute of Archaeology also commissioned Shaibai Mostamindi to survey Shapei Shoto. Here, where he conducted 7 campaigns from 1965 to 1972. Following him, the Maria Lighthouses continued the study of Shapei Shoto during 6 campaigns from 1973 to 1979 and carried out 2 campaigns of excavation in Tapato Pekalan from 1977 to 1979. The successive archaeological works have established that the earliest remains are dated from the 2nd century CE and that a generalized fire destroyed the sites around the 9th century CE during the Islamic conquest. But we will come back to the problem of dating later. As we will see in this presentation, the art of Haḍḍa is one of high artistic quality. We can see here a Buddha, a Triratna bearer, a genie with flowers, laughing and sulky monks, and a demon from Mara's army. It bears the mark of many local and foreign artistic influences, Indian, Hellenistic, but also Central Asian. And it depicted local and foreign figure types. Here an Afghan donor, a Semitic Brahman, and barbarian Gallic Brahmans. Little by little, the technical choices of modelers turn out to be daring and original, as we will see in the niche 13, decorated with statues in the round, detached from the wall. It should be noted that because of the predominance of modeling, it was first necessary to prove that the art of Haḍḍa was an integral part of the art of Gandhara, mostly known through its schools of schist sculpture. The first assumption of Fuxian Bartu in regard to this substitution was the absence of stone in the region. However, a study found that several quarries existed near the sites. Thus, the use of modeling seems to be a deliberate choice, an affirmed preference. Thanks to works of Pakistani, Afghani, Italian, and other colleagues, the works of modeling is now reported on Pakistani sites, of course at Taxila, but also Ranigat, Shalsada, Rokri, Tahte Sangin, Saribalol, in many Afghan excavations around Kabul at Tape Maranjan, Tape Naranj, Roja Safa, Messainak and Goldara in Logar province, Tape Sardar near Ghazni, Bamiyan, Fandokistan, Paitawa, Karacha, Sorkhotal, many sites in Uzbekistan, Darvajin Tepe, Khalshayan and Kara Tepe, and in Chinese Central Asia, at Kucha and Karachar. Nowadays, we consider that there is no longer one, but several manifestations of Gandharan art, which is precisely the question we will raise during this seminar. The diversity that we can observe can result from many factors: nature of material, origin of artistic influences, but also aesthetic choices, new composition mode, and peculiar iconographic choices. Let us consider some examples in Haḍḍa's artistic production, first of all to highlight similarities between Haḍḍa and other sites of Gandhara. Most of the time, the composition of sculpted scene discovered in Haḍḍa is quite similar to the ones found on Gandharan relief. Here is, for example, a conventional relief from Haḍḍa. The upper register represents the offering of a handful of dust, the lower register, the first sermon of Benares. There are also specific episodes that were widespread because of regional predilection, as for example the Dipankara Jataka, which takes place in part in Afghanistan. In this episode, the devotee Sumega spread out his hair spontaneously over a puddle, so that Dipankara, the Buddha of the past, wouldn't get his feet dirty. Thus, Sumega received the prediction of its next incarnation under the appearance of the Buddha Shakyamuni. From our iconographic examination of the wall decoration of Haḍḍa's monastery, it appears that the most represented canonical episodes of Buddha's hagiography are scenes of Jataka on the one hand, miracles and conversions on the other hand. In short, episode from the third part of his life, from the first sermon, which seems to be by far the favorite subject, until Mahaparinirvana. As in the rest of the Gandharan production, protagonists of Buddhist legend are mostly represented under a well-known idealized aspect. Here we can note the meditation attitude, half-closed almond eyes, quiet expression, Ujnisha and Urna for Buddhas. Tarzi conducted a detailed study on modeling techniques in regard to different material used: unbaked clay, clay covered with stucco, lime stucco, and plaster stucco, and concerning the settings and cores of the sculptures. On this subject, I refer you to Tarzi's article. The discovery of Nisha clay sculptures by Ariella Bolatti, dating back to the Arsacids around the middle of the 2nd century CE, allowed to observe the continuity of this technique from the Hellenistic period to the Kushan, which then developed towards Gandhara. Study has shown that some smaller heads discovered in Haḍḍa resulted from a molding technique obtained through the pressure of a mask on the clay of stucco. Could these masks have been copied, or did they travel in the suitcase of itinerant artists? Following this idea, we said earlier that from its first discovery, the artistic production of Haḍḍa was put in parallel with that of Taxila, in spite of the geographical distance. Fouché went so far as to announce that the excavations of Sir John Marshall prepared in advance the interpretation of Haḍḍa, and that from Jalalabad to Rawalpindi we were dealing with the same school of art. We will return to the problematic and implications of such links for traveling workshops and artists at the end of the presentation. Note that the excavation of Tapenarenj and Roja Safa around Kabul and Messainak in Logar province have recently brought to light examples of populated niches similar to those of Haḍḍa and Taxila. Let us now consider disparities on the specific sites of Haḍḍa. What can strike the spectator is the apparent opposition between idealized canonical figures and characters full of vitality and realism. The faces of secondary figures were certainly sometimes executed with a mold, but every detail of the face and the hair was reworked while the material was still soft, thus offering an astonishing variety of types as a result. Stucco allowed the coroplasts to give free rein to their imagination and to take the liberty of representing donors, monks, and demons with increasingly individualized or caricatured faces. Note that the boldness of the artist modelers allow them to marry in the same space idealized and realistic types. Their works reflect the desire to capture and touch the viewer through an exasperation of feelings, accentuating the violence of the facial expression. The variety of physical ethnic types echoes the variety of artistic influences. Here a few local Afghan, Indian, Western, and Asian figures. In the same way, artists did not hesitate to mix in the same place figures from various artistic influences. Let us now take a closer look at some eloquent examples of original and unique artistic expression of the Haḍḍa modeling school. It is a stucco niche representing the Renunciation, also called Sleep of the Woman, episode preceding the Great Departure. Extremely refined, this scene is reduced to its main actors. Asleep, Yashodhara Gopa supports her head with one hand, wearing a necklace and bracelets. Her moon and solar disk dress emphasizes a Sasanian influence, perhaps Yaftalit. Behind her is a squire Chandaka. His features are highly individualized. He wears an unusual shaped cap, a turban that goes back and forth on the front of the forehead. His depressed eyes and emaciated face give him a tormented expression as he presents his helmet to Siddhartha. The hairstyle of the prince is peculiar. It is neither a turban nor a diadem, but a helmet with a circular ornament incised with concentric circles. This type of dress is often met in representation from Mathura. Siddhartha is in a position of relaxation, Lalitasana, ready to get up. Unfortunately, his head and part of his arm are missing. The faces, the jewels, and the rendering of the bodies testify more of an Indian and local influence than of an Hellenistic one, and the torso of the prince, round and hunching forwards, reminds of the later art of Uzbekistan. The composition of this niche is resolutely unconventional, reduced to its main protagonists. Furthermore, in Buddhist composition, it is usually the Buddha who occupies the center of the scene. Here, however, it is Siddhartha's dress that occupies the main spot and catches the viewer's eye. It is an original dramatic process which focuses not only on the depicted scene, that decisive and heartbreaking moment in which Siddhartha will abandon his family, but also on a symbolic object, the turban, whose worship was widespread in Gandhara. We will see a painted representation of this cult a little further. Note that this tendency to simplification is found on several reliefs and constitutes an originality of Haḍḍa. Little by little, the artistic audacity of the school will also express through the modeling techniques itself, giving birth to works almost completely detached from their support in very high relief and more monumental. Here are some examples of three-dimensional representations unfolding in niche and Chaitya, depicting characters marked by a strong Hellenistic heritage. Decorating the courtyard of the Viorel 1 in Tapai Shotor, the niches V2 and 3 represent the first summon of Benares, Buddha enthroned in colossal proportion, surrounded by acolytes. Excavations and study of these niches were conducted by Tarzi. One 40 meters wide, for one 30 meters deep, it is dated from TSH2, second part of the 2nd century CE. The center is occupied by the Buddha, seated on a high base covered with foliage, while other figures are standing on a low bench leaning against the side walls. 5 monks, tutelary guardians, deities, and donors. On each side of the Buddha, the bottom corners of the niche feature 2 particularly interesting protagonists. On his right is Vajrapani, represented as Heracles. Bearded and wearing a moustache and short curls, his face exudes gravity. He sits on a rock, it also pivoting to present him 3/4, and his face turned to the Buddha. With one hand, he holds the Vajra on his knee. Is dressed with a leonte, knocked at the hips and covering his thighs, while the head of the animal lay back on his shoulder. The Heracles who lent this type to this Vajrapani was identified by Tarzi. It is about the reappearance of a type that goes back to the Heracles epitrapesios of Lysippus, and more particularly to its Greco-Bactrian variant that we found on Tidemus coins, last third of the 3rd BCE. In this connection and concerning comparative to the study of this type of Heracles in Hellenistico-Buddhist art, I refer you to Tarzi works. The depiction of the anatomy, whether in proportion of musculature, the flexibility of the garment, and the serious expression of the face, make it a masterpiece of Haḍḍa's art. The female figure, arranged symmetrically mirroring Vajrapani, reveals the same degree of Hellenistic influence. Her head, slightly inclined backward, looks toward the Buddha. With one hand raised, she throws flowers at him, while her other hand holds a vegetal cornucopia overflowing with fruit. She is wearing a long chiton, knocked under the chest by a belt, and a coat covering her legs and back rests on her shoulder. The style of this woman is that of the TKE of Fortuna, who lent her type to represent Ariti, deity of abundance and fertility, here in a position of genie with flowers. The drapery is of Greek or Roman influence, while the necklace and bracelet are of Kushano-Persian type. Let's take a look at the V3 Chaitya. This niche is similar to the previous, but Vajrapani is represented as Alexander the Great. His long curly hair, adorned by a diadem, frames a birdless but virile face marked by pathos. The adaptation of tutelary guardians is revealing of the virtuosity of artists of Haḍḍa, borrowing foreign motifs at leisure to adapt them to the Buddhist legend. Note that in no case is it the phenomenon of interpretatio, although the artist makes comparison by analogies between attributes and functions. It is indeed the Indian characters of the Buddhist legend who are represented under these Greek features. The realization of populated niches reaches its most successful state in the niche of the Naga. This jewel of the campaign of Mostamindi was executed during TSH2, but was remodeled during TSH5 period, last half of the 3rd and first half of the 4th century CE. The floor was elevated by 40 centimeters and all surfaces were fully decorated. It is 240 meters wide for 290 meters deep. The entire niche was badly damaged by a fire that caused the roof to fall down, and the disintegrations of statues by the internal combustion of their wooden core. However, it is preserved on a height of about 2 meters. Of the 13 or 14 characters, measuring about 150 meters and modeled in the round or in very high relief, 6 were still partially preserved: the Buddha, the Nagaraja, Vajrapani, and a few Deva or Bodhisattva. The scene was set in an aquatic context. The walls and floors were covered in sinuous waves, representing swirls from which emerged flowers, lotuses, and wriggling fish associated with monstrous marine congeners, serpentine fish with double heads and formidable teeth. Clothes seemed wet and the air waved under the effect of water. It is a new fact the scene is taking place underwater and not just near the basin where Naga lives, as is it usually the case. The Nagaraja occupies the center of the middle of the composition, off-centered to the left. Dressed in a long wet uttarasanga clinging to his body, is kneeling, and a snake is climbing up his back, revealing his nature. The location of the Buddha is not certain, but we agree with Southey's demonstration that he was probably standing in front of the Nagaraja. On this subject and about characters' identification, I refer you to the articles of Kuwayama, Mostamindi, and Tarzi. Several interpretations have been made to identify this scene. It could be the representation of the tribute of the king Nagakalika to the Buddha, but another view supported by Mostamindi is that the scene depicted a local adaptation of the legend of Nagagopala, reported by Yansang, Songyun, and Shifayen. For more details, I refer you to these travel reports translated by Bill and the works of Mostamindi. In addition to its iconographic interest, the artistic quality of this niche is remarkable. The undertaking is very bold and is an accomplishment in itself. It is about populating a three-dimensional space with life-size statues, arranging them on several planes in depth. Artists invent various attitudes. Kneeling is represented at different moments of the act. Mostamindi evokes a supremely refined art, an attentive realism of human forms, a science of drapery with set of fabrics falling in masses, dripping, or plaited on bodies that we might think naked. These features, again, will be found later in the art of Fundukistan. According to Mostamindi, this niche is to be placed under the direct influence of Hellenistic art. The composition of niche 13 is still unparalleled in Gandharan art. As our iconographic investigation aiming to search for precedents and correlations cannot be detailed within this presentation, we will summarize it through some examples. The aquatic element represented by sinuous waves is not new. The relief of the eastern Torana of Sanchi depicts the miracle of the walk on the water, during which the Buddha saves the instrument of worship that the Keshapa had left behind from Nairanjana in flood. Note the similarity between the representation of the lotus profile in this relief and in the niche 13, the long sinuous stem emerging from the water and the blossomed flower triangular in shape. We also find this type of waves out of the Buddhist religious context, for example, in the Iwan of Penjikent, which date was lowered by Giovanni Verardi to the 4th century CE, executed with the same material and technique. The scene features Naga represented as fish-tailed men in an aquatic environment. The sinuous modeled waves evoke swirls of water, as in the niche 13. The cave number 5 of the Udayagiri complex, studied by Artur Basham, also present many similarities with our niche. Cave number 5 is dated from the 5th century CE. It is decorated with a large carved relief of about 4 meters wide. The scene also unfolds on the side panels, which gives it a depth, also it remains in low relief. It is a representation of Vara, the incarnation of Vishnu as a wild boar, rescuing the goddess of the earth, Bhudevi, also called Prithvi, from the engulfment of the ocean. Vara stands with his left foot resting on a rock. A female figure stands to his right, carrying a lotus stem that wraps around him and a little Bhudevi is holding onto the flower at shoulder level of the boar. In the lower register in front of them stand the Nagaraja. Water is depicted by sinuous lines representing the swirl of waves, and flowers and lotus stems decorate the scene. On the left side panel, the goddesses Yamuna and Ganga stand in the middle of waters, represented by undulating lines converging and separating to meet again. According to Basham, the imagery of the aquatic world and the way of representing water by incised undulating lines has a classical Western origin, as it was suggested for the niche 13. To conclude this comparative iconographic study of aquatic representations, we can mention Buddhas of Mathura and their wet drapery echoing the outfit of the character of niche 13. How to determine the path taken by artistic influences? Did they travel from Bactria to Gandhara and then India, or from India to Gandhara then Bactria, or on medial direction, back and forth? Based on the oldest dating of the aquatic niche of Tapei Shotor and Iwan of Penjikent, it would be tempting to think that this type of composition was the result of a Greco-Bactrian influence. So why then have we not found more? We must keep in mind the fragility of such niches decorated in high relief. They might have existed in number but not survived the passage of time. We can only hope that future discoveries will help answer this interrogation. Let's go back to the composition of the niche 13 in a more general way. To our knowledge, there are no parallels to three-dimensional representations populated by statues in the round from the same period and geographic area. The cave of Mogao at Dunhuang, discovered by Sir Overstein and dated from the 4th century CE, have undoubtedly been inspired by this type of three-dimensional representation. The artistic influences from Bactria having traveled to the Central Asian regions are numerous, and China very early established a parallel between the stucco of Karachar in Xinjiang and the stucco of Haḍḍa, which deserved to be examined more closely. Let's move to an enigmatic iconographic choice, the unfinished painted representation of the conversion of Angulimala discovered by Bartu. The Viora B56, containing the B55 stupa and dating from TSH 56, half of the 4th until the beginning of the 5th century CE, was entirely decorated with paintings and model sculptures from the retaining walls to the enclosure and from the inside to the outside. Its iconography is dedicated to the moksha ceremony, a ritual of giving and redemption during which the king, the prince, or the noble donates all of his wealth before redeeming everything by prayer. On the exterior facade, the spaces between the pilasters were painted. The first bore the sketch of the conversion of Angulimala, literally wreath of fingers or necklace of fingers. We do not have any photography, fortunately a drawing by Bartu. Tradition agrees to present Angulimala as being inclined to violence. In his previous life, he was a man-eating yaksha, and in the ones before, he was mostly characterized by his strength and lack of compassion. This highwayman was killing travelers and mutilating their bodies, keeping their fingers mounted in a necklace as trophy. When the number of his victims reached 999, the inhabitant of the region, in revolt, asked the king of Koshala for the death of Angulimala. While his own mother was trying to save his life, he conceived the idea of making her his 1000th victim. Thanks to his omniscience, the Buddha became aware of his intention and went to the scene. As soon as he appeared, Angulimala tried to kill the Buddha. A pursuit and a verbal battle ensued, from which the Buddha came out victorious. Confused, Angulimala embraced the Dharma and joined the community. He was then called Ahimsa as the non-violent and quickly reached awakening despite his heavy karmic charge. On this sketch, drawn in red ochre, the Buddha in mention stands in the center of the scene. Angulimala, wearing a simple dhoti, is ready for the attack, his left hand raised and the right hand firmly clutching his sword. As often, this episode is represented through the process of continuous storytelling. At his feet, the same Angulimala prostrates himself after his conversion. His mother stands on the far left, her arm raised as if to stop the murderous gesture. Vajrapani is represented standing behind the Buddha, the Vajra leaning on his shoulder. At his feet, a hallowed figure kneels in Anjali Mudra towards the Buddha seated in meditation on a throne, probably the same Angulimala after he joined the Sangha. Figures are lean, their graceful attitude is swayed. The proportion and physiognomy are faithfully rendered, the body carried forward of Angulimala leaning on one leg, or the torsion of Vajrapani are beautifully represented. Bartu writes that the location of the breadth of fingers was indicated by painted dots. He emphasizes the skill of the artist who realizes drawing with a fast and safe hand without retouching or resumption. The sketch step was probably intended to better represent proportions and positions. Unfortunately, in this case, the work was never finished. A last word about symbolism. The decoration of Virabi 56 being dedicated to a moksha ceremony, it is necessary to wonder about the iconographic choice of the conversion of Angulimala for the less enigmatic. How to understand the association of these two themes, the moksha and the conversion of a murderer saved by the Buddha? Because of the extreme nature of this conversion, it would be adventurous to imagine that this episode could have had a particular renown among a powerful family of kings or princes. And yet, maybe did they compare themselves with Angulimala? Indeed, who can deny this down-to-earth and very human observation? After all, if the worst of criminals can attain awakening, why not me? Fortiori, why not a king? Have committed some slight exaction, certainly unfortunate, but inherent to his function. Nevertheless, the choice of this scene is quite original. Now let's take a look on another example of painting in the cave of meditation A, situated next to the water tank and studied by Tarzi. The construction of Cave A dates back to the TSH4 period, second part of the 3rd century CE. The painting was executed around the TSH6 during a repair following a collapse. It is located in a vaulted gallery, 960 meters long by 285 meters wide and 220 meters high. The lower part of the room was decorated with drapes of alternating colors, surmounted by a vegetal frieze made of leaves and fruits. 10 monks were depicted in the upper part of the walls, dressed in samgati and seated in meditation, each under a tree and on a flower bed, their names written in Brahmi. Flames were bursting from the shoulder of 8 of them. The wall facing the entrance was occupied by a skeleton standing within a black frame between 2 monks. This cave was most likely a place of meditation where the monks came to ponder the cycle of life and death. According to literary traditions, these arhats were direct followers of the Buddha and the protectors of the law after his Mahaparinirvana. Depending on various sources, their numbers and names vary, but the personality common to these different lists are those of Mahakashyapa, Ananda, and Rahula, the son of Shakyamuni. We notice immediately that the representation of the skeleton is quite approximate. The anatomy is doubtful, especially in terms of proportions of the bones with the skull, pelvis, and joints. But the virtuosity is better shown in the faces of monks. Aniruddha is represented on the southeast wall. His face has been scared by iconoclasts. He is depicted as a mature man, shaven and white-haired. On the northwest wall is Maitrayaniputra, portrayed as a young monk. Tarzi makes different observations about the technique. First, the drawing was sketched in red ochre. Then the artist applied solid colors that he diluted to create shades, and finally he completed it through the addition of black touches. Between monk 9 and 2, is a scene depicted the adoration of the Buddha's patra. We know the importance of the bowl, which symbolizes the base of the Dharma. The patra is decorated with 4 incisions at its neck, reminiscent of the offering of the Chatur Maharajika, and contains a reddish protruding elements identified as flowers by Tarzi. The patra is flanked by 2 banners ending in curious winged discs and decorated with flying ribbons. At least 3 characters were represented on each side of the bowl under this banner. The best preserved is a man painted in profile, of which only the face remains. He is mustached and has a large tonsure, leaves the top of his head bare. By the presence of the other characters, the scene can tentatively be identified as a representation of the presentation ceremony of the true Buddha Patra as reported by Yansang. Symmetrically between monks 9 and 10 is the scene of the adoration of the turban, that we can put in parallel with the representation of the renunciations that we saw previously, itself focused on the turban. This fragment is depicting 3 female devotees coming to pay homage to the turban. Unfortunately, we do not have any representation, but it consisted in a huge winged crown adorned with beaded croissants. Represented in profile, they all have large almond-shaped eyes and prominent noses. They wear long red dresses, and their curly black hair is coiffed in such a way that ringlets frame their faces, leaving their ears visible, a hairstyle often found on the Haḍḍa's female donors, for example, on these painted niches, and on this female donor modeling both from Haḍḍa. A diadem of white pearls is placed on their hair, and they also wearing large red earrings and necklaces. It may be noted that the style of these figures is quite different from that of the monks and donors, and reminding more of Greco-Oriental artistic influence. It is unfortunately difficult to print painted works as they are underrepresented and over unfinished. As it was already the case in regard to modeling, we can observe that several styles and influences mixed in the scenes. Here, some figures seem to reproduce a local Indian type, like monks and donors. Others, like female donors, echo the Greco-Oriental painting, while others, like this guardian deity, can be compared to the painting of Bamiyan. This is from Haḍḍa, this is from Bamiyan. And those of Xinjiang, Miran, basically in the region of Turfan and Kucha. In his book, Mikhail Rostovtsev noted that the painting technique of Haḍḍa was similar to the one used in Palmyra and Dura-Oropos. According to him, their works could thus be dated from the last Parthian or the first Sassanids. Hellenistic influence through the Persians seems to be a possible origin. However, India also had its specific school of painting. On this subject, everything remains to be discovered. Lastly, I depart from the specific theme of differences and similarities to mention what I propose to consider as symbolic and atmosphere seen in Buddhist monasteries of Haḍḍa. We have hazarded an hypothesis about the representation of the warriors of Mara's army in the form of atlas-like figures on stupa. Referring to the Lalita Vistara passage describing the fights between the god of pleasure and the Buddha, we know that cohorts of sons of Mara, his warriors demons, successively submitted to the power of Shakyamuni. In this context, the representation of Mara's army on stupa in the form of atlas-like figures does not seem to us innocuous and purely decorative. Their architectural role of support element for the stupa itself decorated to the glory of the Buddha with reliefs celebrating his life or with the multiplication of his images could symbolically recall the victory of the Buddha on these armies. Ancient texts commonly refer to different metaphorical notions, or rather vague, such as Buddha's land, Buddha's fields, Buddha Kshetra, and words of Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva Bhumi, in which are integrated series of successions of Buddha, 1,000 Buddha, 7 Buddha of the past, whose lists slightly differ according to different monastic schools. These conceptual places and lists are part of a vertical Buddhist cosmology, giving rise to a very complex stage deployment of events and worlds. These notions exist from the beginning in the decoration of Buddhist monasteries, as evidenced by the representation of events observed in Senchi. Considering the exuberance of the decoration of Haḍḍa, this description finds an echo in the multiplication and superposition of statues. Almost all the public part of the monastery, stupa, chaitya, enclosures, and niches were decorated with Buddha, Bodhisattva, Deva, worshipper, and genie. During the late repairs, artists added benches populated with large standing statues, sometimes elbow to shoulder, and did not hesitate to slip smaller Buddha in meditation between two statues. Some reuse show that, if necessary, artists did not hesitate to break a modeling to place it elsewhere in a more confined space. This artistic horror of emptiness, this juxtaposition of figures, appears to us as a desire to symbolically represent the Buddhist cosmology. It seems that the decoration of the Sangharama, considered as a whole, could thus be perceived as an atmosphere scene which not narrative but symbolic. Here are Buddhist events, Bodhisattva worlds, and Buddha's fields, sheltering stupa in a kind of cosmological mise en abîme. Thus, also Haḍḍa's monasteries were occupied by the Theravada Sarvastivadin sect. Their decoration attests of an evolution towards a Mahāyānistic iconography. The manuscripts of Bajau revolutionized the idea we had about the two great schools of Buddhism, for a long time considered opposite and incompatible. Indeed, in the Bajau library, Theravada and Mahayana documents used to stand side by side. The profusion of images refers to late speculations having their source in the development of the Mahayana concept of rasa, the aesthetic feeling capable of interrupting the samsara cycle of the observer throughout the duration of the aesthetic emotion. As we saw in Haḍḍa, devotees were immersed in the Buddhist universe no matter where they lay their eyes. If we refer to the concept of rasa, the more images there were, the longer the contemplation and interruption of the samsara. Note, however, that it is probably the multiplication of images that inspired the development of this concept and not the opposite. Let us come to the many shadowy interrogations surrounding the issues of dating, Hellenistic influence, and ancient workshops operation. Works of Mostamindis and Tarzi establish the chronology of Tapai Shotor and Tapatopekalan. Unfortunately, Bartu did not share his observations on stratigraphy. The absence of these data does not allow us to clearly apprehend the different stages of construction, nor to establish the dating of the modeling from monasteries excavated. An alternative could be an aesthetic study based on stylistic analogy, but this type of approach is always perilous. Our lack of knowledge concerning ancient workshops makes this solution complicated, since it's problematic for now to match a particular work to a specific workshop. Furthermore, idealized and realistic works that everything seems to oppose were often represented side by side, while studies showed that they could come from the same workshop and period. It appears that the artist of Haḍḍa wanted to strike the lay faithful, marking his imagination to transcend his face and subjugating him with new and original representation. We know that in addition to their talent and verve, they had a perfect knowledge of Hellenistic theme that led to the creation of masterpieces. This vigorous Hellenistic heritage could be explained by the existence of numerous Greco-Bactrian workshops capable of transmitting a solid and lively Greek tradition, as supported by several observations. Particularly, Greek inscriptions testify of a living Greek-speaking community, attesting to the presence and establishment of Greeks in Bactria. Based on the similarity between Tapai Shotor and Sarivalol, Tarzi considers that the great activity of modelers can only correspond to a period of political stability and economic prosperity, allowing exchanges between workshops. Francine Tissot abounds in this direction. According to her, the permanent demand invited artists to settle in Gandhara for more than 5 centuries. We can assume that in contact with travelers and traveling artists from India, China, or the West, Gandharan artists remained aware of fashions, foreign models, and new techniques. Masters creating prototypes admired and reproduced, no doubt increasing the fame of some workshops. The number of monasteries and the incessant passage of pilgrims have certainly led to multiplication of workshops, which had to settle in the valleys and spread consequently, working on their own. Adding to this Greek heritage, we know that there were later waves, successive waves of Roman artistic influences, maybe via art objects and coin circulation. Like we said earlier in the discussion, it is difficult to apprehend the vehicles of translation. We agree with Tissot's view that we have to imagine a complete organization with patronage, projects, coordinated artists and teams. The first works of art commissioned by the monks were probably subjected to strict requirements. Then Gandharan artists found inspiration in everyday life that they combined with the exigency of the canonical narrative to create new relief and other model composition. We mention on several occasions the similarity between the artistic production of Haḍḍa and Taxila. Should we consider that there might have been a special link between these two workshops, ignoring the intermediate school of art situated along the way? If so, what could have been the form taken by these direct contacts? Perhaps exchange of models, masks and objects, perhaps even exchange of artists and masters. Unfortunately, it is impossible to express an opinion without a thorough comparative iconographic and stylistic study. What means could be put in place in order to improve our work? I really think that a first step should be the establishment of archaeological database which would provide support for the examination of artistic influences and iconographic themes and facilitate the access to scientific data for researchers and students. This has been the focus on my work for the past years with the archaeological material of Haḍḍa. The vigor and autonomy of Haḍḍa's art is sufficient to explain its influence, which can be followed from Kapisa to Chinese Central Asia through Bactria and Bamiyan. These links, however, remain very imprecise. Thanks to a working group like this, we have the possibility to discuss and develop waves that could be put in place to facilitate multidisciplinary studies in order, I hope, to clarify these questions one after the other. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're opening the floor for discussion, and I'm not sure how long we have.
I think we've got about 10, but we can manage 10.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this beautiful presentation. I just had one question, and perhaps I didn't hear you very clearly, but it was about the multiplication of Buddhas as decorative elements. And you linked that with the development of Buddha fields.
Yes.
And so were you suggesting that it was actually the multiplication of Buddhas as visual elements that led to these doctrinal developments in Mahayana thought? And then one other suggestion I wanted to make too is that would we perhaps also be able to consider these multiplication of Buddhas as more of a kind of manifestation of these biographies of past Buddhas, like in the Vajrakalpa, And how would you distinguish between the imagery of the Buddha fields from that kind of thousands of or innumerable Buddhas in the Buddha fields in the Vajrakalpa?
Yeah. For your first question, it's a possibility. I don't pretend that the multiplication of images led to the concept of rasa, but it's one of the possibilities. We didn't know how it. And your second question is about the multiplication of Buddhas.
Right, the multiplication of Buddhas going far back into the past, because we have also not only fragments of the Akshobhya Vyuha or this kind of Buddha field type text in the Vajra fragments, but we also have Vajrakalpika Sutra fragments in the Skoyan collection in Bamiyan, and that's kind of something that Stefan has worked on.
It's published, yeah.
It's published, and I'm just wondering if that might be a better association with this multiplication of Buddha images in the art of Haḍḍa and other places.
Yeah, I understand. That's of course a possibility too. I'm not pretend. I'm just proposing this, but I'm going to examine more closely what you are saying to me. Thank you.
Thank you for this good presentation. I want to ask about the skeleton which was named and engraved between the two monks. Various interpretation can be given by scholars, this one. But do you think that it was actually the case that skeleton was named at that time when the Buddhists cremated the dead bodies?
Excuse me. I haven't really.
Okay. The skeleton between the two monks.
Yeah.
That is something problematic to me.
Okay.
I cannot understand it exactly.
Oh, well.
Though the painting is very good, but the interpretation is.
I understand. Sorry. Okay. So, in some Vira cells of monks, we found real skeleton bones, and we know that it is for meditation on life and death. So that the hypothesis for this
It's possible.
yeah, an niche of meditation.
What it reminds me of is depictions that you see quite frequently in modern Sri Lanka, for instance, that illustrate meditation on impermanence based on the Satipatthana Sutta in particular. So there you have different stages of decomposition, ending, of course, in a skeleton. Do you think this is comparable and could have a similar textual basis, like the Satipatthana Sutta?
I have to examine that. I don't know. Yeah, because in this representation there is no several phase of the composition, only the skeleton. But it is a possibility, of course.
It could be interesting to compare to the Sri Lankan
Of course, yeah.
depictions.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, your question is just, I think it's Caglioti or Anna Maria or
Anna Maria.
who identified it as one of the objects of meditation. But then I have no idea what Aniruddha and Maitreya and Niputra would be doing.
Like I try to explain, there are several lists according to different traditions, and Aniruddha and Maitreya and Niputra are not maybe well known, but their names were written in Brahmi scriptures, so they are their names.
Yeah.
Just a suggestion, because you made the comparative study of the Haḍḍa sculpture, struggle sculpture with the text lab. But there are large number as concerned the mural paintings we have discussed in detail Lebanon, but even in Gandhara, in Texla region, we have discovered a large number of mural painting. This morning I have shared with you. So that is from the Jannah Varadiri. So these are the first paintings, mural painting, which were found in the actually in the entrance of the monasteries. So that we have dated for 5th century. And we saw date even Professor Fachana. He's also discovered, that was the paintings of Bodhisattva, that was fixed just on the drums of the stupa. And some are also discovered by Professor Nasim Khan from Kashimismas. So he has also published the paintings of Gandhara Pakistani sites.
That's a great piece to continue the comparison. Thank you.
So
Thank you.
very much, Alexandra.